to the computer. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. I begin, as I always begin, in the name of Allah, whose grace I seek in this and all other matters. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce Marina Mahathir, who is a newspaper columnist and activist. She led an HIV/AIDS NGO for 12 years, served on the board of Sisters in Islam for 6 years, and is currently the chair of the board of Musawah, the global movement for justice and equality in the Muslim family. Marina has also produced TV programs, feature films, and a documentary, and founded Zavigo, I don't know if that's correct pronunciation, zavigo.com, which is a website for women and travel. Currently, she also hosts Hello Zavigo, an online chat show and a podcast on books called Busy Reading Books. Penguin Random House will publish her memoirs in November 2021, which hopefully she will say something about as I give her the floor. Please, Marina.
Assalamualaikum, everybody, and good morning to those in my time zone and good evening to everyone else. Thank you, Amina, for having me on this talk. It's a real pleasure and it's a real honor. I thought I would talk a little bit first about my background. Since you heard my biography and it seems to be very eclectic, so I thought a little bit of light on my background might be interesting, and tell you a little bit about my journey and how I came to be here today. So I was born in the north of Malaysia in a state called Kedah to doctor parents. My parents were born before the war in the 1920s, met at university in Singapore and fell in love, and then got married. And I think the seeds of, well, I don't know whether you'd call it feminism, but they both took medicine, and which is a very long course already. My father was the hotshot, very top student at university, and so he finished in 6 years. My mother was slower, failed her exams and had to repeat her first year and repeat her last year. But her father, who, you know, my parents started dating from the first year, but my mother's father said that they could not get married until she finished. And so my poor father had to wait an extra 2 years, I think, before they finally got married. So the whole idea of education and the importance of it was instilled very early on in our family from my mom's dad. My paternal grandfather was a school teacher. He was the first Malay to become a principal of the top school in our city, an English school, because he was an English teacher, very insistent that his children all spoke good English. And his origins, actually, we are descendants of immigrants. My great-grandfather on my father's side came from India, came to Penang, like a lot of people at that time, as a merchant, as a trader, probably from the Malabar coast in Kerala, India, and came, married a local, had children, had my grandfather who married a local, and then he formed his own family, of which my father was the youngest. On my mother's side, and I think this also leads to the way we think these days, my grandfather came from Sumatra. His father had a wife who was barren. And so after many years of marriage and no children, my great-grandfather asked permission of his wife to marry another. And the first wife said, okay, but you give me the first child. And so he married another woman, and the first child was my grandfather, who was given to his stepmother and was brought up by her, and was very, very close to her. The thing is, the second wife kept producing children, and the first wife became an unpaid nanny, more or less. And she finally got fed up. She said, I'm done with this. And she decided she wanted to go home to Malaya, where her family is from. And she took my grandfather with her. And he was just a little boy. I guess today you would call it child kidnapping. But there didn't seem to have been many protests. And so this woman took my grandfather to Malaya and brought him up. And I think this is why, seeing the way, I don't know what she's told him about the whole thing, but this is why I think he grew up as really not at all in favor of polygamy. And in fact, he only had one wife. He had 10 children, of which my mother was the youngest girl. And he actually was a civil servant, and he did work in the religious department in Selangor State, where he helped to enact the laws that made it difficult for men to take another wife. Yes, he put up all the regulations where, the man had to go to court to submit his reasons why he wanted another one, needed the woman's signature, his wife's signature, consent to marry another. And that stood for well over 30 years before, things happened and those regulations got loosened. But my grandfather believed very much that polygamy was not fair to women, I guess, from his own childhood experience. So that's the atmosphere that I grew up with in our small town in Alostar. And my mom always worked. She was head of the hospital. She was the state health director. She helped to do all sorts of campaigns for public health, anti-cholera and everything. And she worked all the way until retirement. And I think what a lot of people didn't know is that while she was employed by the government, she was a contract officer and was never given a permanent employment, which means her contract had to be renewed every few years. Why was that? Because she was married. The assumption was that once she married, she has someone to take care of her, so she doesn't really need a permanent contract. And so, because she could drop out anytime, right? So no, she didn't. She worked all the way until retirement and just put up with it, which means she had no pension. She has no pension. Anyway, so I grew up in that atmosphere with a strong emphasis on education, and I did the whole conveyor belt, school and university. And I always loved writing, and I wanted to be a journalist, and that's how I started off in my life. And just to cut a long story short, it was while I was working on a women's magazine that I became more aware of women's issues. I started to do some fundraising for various charities, and I wound up doing a lot of public relations and communications work. And eventually one day, and this was after marriage and a child and a move to Japan with my then husband and moved back, one day I got the call that changed my life, basically. A friend of mine, Mrs. Gurusamy, who is part of this national women's organization, called me up and said, Marina, we have started the Malaysian AIDS Foundation. There are not enough women on the board. Would you come and join us? And I thought it was fortuitous because I was already thinking about HIV/AIDS at the time. I had read a lot about it in the papers and everything. And I was wondering what I could do. And I thought, as usual, I could raise funds. And so I think that was what they wanted me for, to help raise money. You have the prime minister. Meanwhile, my father had become prime minister, of course. Prime minister's daughter on board and all that must be good for the foundation. What they didn't know and what I didn't know at the time was how involved I would get in the whole issue of HIV/AIDS. And I learned that very quickly. I went to that first meeting and I realized now, reflecting back, that it was actually a trap. They had intended to make me chair of the board, and they did. And I had never, ever chaired anything in my life. And so I had to learn things very quickly, just how the procedures of how to chair even a meeting. I had no idea. But luckily, I had very, very nice colleagues who taught me. And I found something very important very quickly, that raising funds for HIV/AIDS is not like raising funds for the famine in Africa or for disabled people or for orphan children. It's something else altogether because of the stigma and the prejudice. I had the most amazing things said to me when I was doing that. If there's no hope, and at that time, 1993, there was no cure and people were just dying, why don't we just shoot them? People would actually say this to me, and it was really astounding. But I found I did have an advantage. Doors would open because people were curious. And so once I got my foot in the door, then it was up to me to persuade people to part with their money. And I soon learned that the best weapon, the best way of doing that, was to be as knowledgeable as possible. So I learned from my colleagues, I learned from the doctors and the scientists and everything, but most of all, I learned from all the communities that were most affected by HIV/AIDS, which meant, in Malaysia at least, the drug users, the sex workers, the LGBT community, the refugees, the migrant workers, the plantation workers, disabled people, all sorts of people. And you can imagine me, as a prime minister's daughter, brought up very sheltered, very prim and proper, and suddenly I'm sitting down with transgender sex workers, learning about their lives and what makes them vulnerable to HIV/AIDS. So that was the beginning. And the other seminal moment, I think, for me, when I went to my first AIDS conference in Yokohama, Japan, and I listened to this talk by this amazing man called Dr. Jonathan Mann. He was the head of the first WHO global program on AIDS, and later on went to head the school, School of Health and Human Rights at Harvard. And he was the first person who explained clearly to me the link between health and human rights, that health is a human right, and that anything that violated your human rights is going to have an impact on your health. And we're seeing that now with COVID very clearly, those who are the poorest, the most marginalized, who have the least information, the least access to treatment, or the least access to vaccines, their health is going to be affected. And so, that was a light bulb moment for me. And I have a story about Jonathan Mann and how I finally met him many years later, but I'll tell that maybe another time, not to make this too long. Anyway, at the Malaysian AIDS Council, the Malaysian AIDS Foundation was for raising funds. The Malaysian AIDS Council was actually the program side of things. I became president of that, and I stayed there for 12 years. And I have to say that in those 12 years, the Marina at the beginning and the Marina at the end were entirely different people. Totally different people. I just grew up so much in those years because I learned so much. I was exposed to so much knowledge, so much experience. And I don't think, you know, I would have ever had that opportunity had I not said yes to that invitation to join the board. And the one thing I must always emphasize, you know, HIV/AIDS is always controversial. And of course, I spent a lot of time battling the people who thought that this was a, you know, a field that you shouldn't touch. There's so much taboo. You're having to talk about sex. You're having to talk about drugs. You're having to talk about all sorts of all these icky things that people didn't really want me to talk about. I mean, I used to get admonitions from the official people that I worked with who said, you know, don't talk so openly about sex and all that. I said, okay, fine. And then I'll do a question and answer. And then somebody will ask me about oral sex. So what do? I have to answer, you know, and you know, it was things like that. So I, of course, came into a lot of trouble with the conservative side and all that, who said I was doing things which were, what do you call it? Yeah, sometimes against religion. And, you know, and a very interesting thing, which I think all of us Muslim feminists also face, is that you are caught between two forces. One that says that you shouldn't do these things because it's un-Islamic. You shouldn't be promoting condoms. You shouldn't be talking to all these LGBT people and that sort of thing. On the other hand, there are also all the secularists who believe that you should leave religion completely out of HIV/AIDS. Completely, because they are a negative force. They don't bring anything good to the cause. They're only a source of trouble and everything. And I didn't believe that, because I was brought up with all the right religious upbringing. My parents saw to that. My grandfather, after all, on my mother's side, was an official of the religious department, as I said. And I had all the basics. I completed reading the Quran. I knew how to pray. I knew all the du'as and everything. And it's part of my life, you know, like a lot of Malaysians, you know, it's just part of life. You fast and everything. So to me, the idea of not having anything religious to do with the cause, to me, didn't make sense. And so, and also I realized that for Malaysians, religion is so important. And a prime example I like to give is that there was a transgender group that had their convention just outside KL. And after their convention, they showed me the list of resolutions that they had come up with. And the first one was how to pray, where to pray. Because as trans people, you know, the way our mosques are set up, men here, women there, where do they go? Because they are not accepted in either. But for me, the fact that this was important to them was the crucial point, that they wanted to pray. And so I realized that not just with them, but all the other communities that I had to deal with, religion was important. So how on earth can we leave it out? And so we at the AIDS Council, we set to work with religious bodies, with the official government religious bodies, to set up a program to talk about HIV/AIDS among the Muslim communities and what we could do. We wanted very positive things to come out of it, and to give basic facts. And what we found was that in the villages around Malaysia, HIV had already arrived, and there were all these village heads and just down at the grassroots level who were seeing it and didn't know what to do about it, and they welcomed us really with open arms, with the knowledge of how to deal with all these families that were losing their sons primarily to drugs and then to HIV. So that was one thing that really motivated us to include religious establishment, religious folks in our HIV work. But for me personally also, I think that whole process was a great awakening, that although I was, I like I said, I had this basic religious upbringing. For me, seeing faith in action was really what did it for me. Seeing where it worked and didn't work. And I don't mean that the religion didn't work, but the way that people put it into action, where it didn't work, where it harmed people, where it particularly harmed women. So around the same time, actually, I remember Zaina calling me up and said, Marina, we're having a press conference for the launch of Sisters in Islam. And I remember very clearly my reaction. My reaction was, what? Because the whole name, Sisters in Islam, to me was rather worrying at the time. I assumed that it would be very, it just sounded very conservative, because at that time, all we associated Islam with was conservatism. That's all we knew, and that's all we saw in Malaysia. But she managed to persuade me to come, and that's where I went to that press conference. I remember seeing you, Amina, and everyone, and just thinking, oh my, this is something else. And so I've been a supporter since, and formally joined in 2009. And then they put me on the board and made me work. And now there's Musawah, of course. 2009 was also the launch of Musawah. I remember the big global conference we had here. I was actually ill. I actually had a terrible cold, but I wasn't going to miss it for anything. So, luckily it was pre-COVID times. Otherwise, I would have infected 200 over people from around the world. But I went, and again, it was a seminal moment, really, listening to all these wonderful women from all over the world and seeing the length and breadth of Muslim women, and how we all, pretty much united for the cause of justice and equality. So I don't know, I think I'll stop there, because here I am now doing all these things. And after all these years, I guess I've had a very eclectic journey, doing many things along the way. I'm still a communications person, which is why I've done TV and film and everything. And now I've always been a writer. I've been writing my newspaper column for 25 years, I think. And now I've written a book, which is a memoir, which is coming out in November, and which talks about a lot of the things that I've already talked about. So I'll stop there for a minute.
Thank you so much. I love learning about the lineage. The crossing of our paths, for me, obviously, was through Sisters in Islam. And whenever there were events that were organized around more liberal or progressive Islamic discourse, we would, sometimes also simultaneously be together. But I was so nervous every time, that I would meet you, because I could only think, the Prime Minister's daughter. And fortunately, and not a lot of people know this, Marina and I share a dentist. My dentist is the same dentist you go to.
Oh, really?
And he's always saying, she's so down to earth, and people say that, but when you're in these like larger settings, you never really know, how they're going to, work out. So you just, you're just polite, but eventually we did start to spend a little bit of time together. Marina always invited me to Eid, Hari Raya celebrations at her house. And when I was living in Indonesia last time, I visited her in her house over there. And eventually I became a little bit more relaxed because, when you grow up poor the way I did, and you meet people in high places, even if they're daughters of people in high places, the first thing you think is that, oh, they're just going to be snobs, So it was very easily squashed.
Oh my gosh, I mean, I've spent all my time being in awe of you that I didn't know any of this.
Oh. And so actually, I think I was most impressed by your intelligence, that you really were very thoughtful, and you really put time into the issues that you became involved with. You weren't just running off of, privilege. You got down, got dirty with those places where there was dirt for that issue to actually be addressed. So the story that I most want to tell is being invited to the first and last Islam HIV/AIDS conference, when I wanted to focus on certain, what I consider to be philosophical and theological factors that impacted vulnerability, particularly for Muslim women and children. And there were some members of the invited large gathering that really took issue with what I was saying and how I was saying it. And a man stood up and told me I was a devil in hijab. It was the first time I'd ever been so assaulted and insulted at a place where we were, literally brought together to talk about an important issue that was also literally impacting people's lives, including Muslims. And that led to a whole big thing. And I'm not going to go to the big thing, except to say that when you guys organized this conference, you paid equal attention to members of the LGBTQ community and activists as you did to those people who were invited because they would lend the scholarship and the religious knowledge or whatever. That there was an even playing field between these participants, and that was the first time that I had been to anything in the name of Islam that wasn't just dealing with women and by women. That was the first time that I'd seen that organization as intentional, and what an impact that would have on how we think about notions of leadership. Unfortunately, with this guy, and I don't even know who he was, and I don't even care to know who he was, and a cadre of about 5 or 6 others that joined with him to protest altogether certain things, including transgender speakers, and my paper, and the fact that the organization was such that we would have these keynote addresses, but then we would break out so that there would be easier access to engaging in some conversation. Again, it was an intentional plan to equalize amongst the participants, which they just did not respect. But as a result of being insulted, a large body of the participants came together to protest those who had protested. And this is why I tell this story. When I sat in one of these meetings with them, I realized that as a cishet woman, I had been on the fence, that I would not say the word homosexual or LGBTQ or non-binary or trans or any of that unless I was forced to by some reason, and that these, it was a large collective, about 70 people, that this collective was coming to my support in a way that I had never come to their support. I was one of those silent supporters. And I could not see the balance between how I had been, I was, like people say, it's like, well, I agree, LGBTQ have rights or, whatever, and they're, but I wasn't active. I wasn't standing up the way they were standing up for me. And that made a change. After that, I became like a full-blown activist, and I took courses and I went to retreats and I learned things, and, eventually, even was able to do a very long research into Islamic classical sources. And I continue to be in that location, despite the fact that in still certain settings, even those working on cisgendered women's issues, there is this reticence to be what I call an out ally. I even presented a paper on what it means to be an out ally. Now I identify as queer and non-binary myself for so many reasons, so I don't have to just be an ally. The other thing that I experienced there, which I had not before, was the religiosity amongst queer Muslims that challenged the notion, which is the main rhetorical statement: you can't be, gay and Muslim, you can't be queer and Muslim. And so for many queer Muslims, when they recognize and accept their own gender identity and cannot separate themselves from that, many of them have chosen to step aside with regard to Islam. I mean, if you don't know where to pray in the mosque, if you're not invited in the mosque in order to, just have your funerary rites, the janazah, I mean, what do? So they voluntarily stepped aside to their Islam. But what I experienced really, in the years subsequent, is how much the call to affirm their identity as Muslims had disturbed them. Some were angry, some never got over the anger, but many of them, and the good news at the end was that many of them, sort of the rainbow after the rain cloud, after the rainstorm, many of them realized that if they just affirm their own identity as Muslims and engage in their own spiritual activity, that they would be whole, that there was no lack of reconciliation between the two prominent identities. And that has been the main place where I've been engaged in the issue of LGBTQ. And I have to thank you, not the man that said nasty things to me, but I have to thank you for inviting me and being put on the spot in such a way that, you have to say to yourself, well, where do I go from here? Do I go back, behind the veil, or do I step up? So alhamdulillah, I did step up, and it's almost been 20 years.
Yes.
And I'm going to ask the first question. There's so much that you said that I wanted to speak about, but I did talk with you earlier about this when we were communicating. And since your memoirs is coming out, I wanted to ask you, like, personally, how did you come to your own agency as an activist, as a progressive thinker, as a Muslim woman who participates in those concerns for people who have been marginalized, either for gender or sexuality or health status? How is it that you took your own agency, that you didn't just ride in on the skirttails of being the daughter of the Prime Minister?
Well, I think partly my upbringing, I was brought up with certain values. My parents, were never made us feel as if we were special because we were, privileged or anything, that we always had to think back to those who have less. And I saw the example of my parents who always volunteered to in their off times. My mom worked at the family planning clinic every week, advising women about birth control and things like that. And my dad was also volunteer the anti-TB, anti-tuberculosis association, etc. So I had that example, and that was always ingrained with us to do things. But I really have to say that working in HIV really did it for me. Like I said, when they first invited me, they had no idea what I could contribute beyond lending my name, beyond fundraising, and neither did I. I really had no idea. But once I delved deep into the issues and the communities, I think there's some ingrained sense of this is not fair that spurred me to learn more, and once I started talking to people who were the most affected, and like, oh, how come, the sense of injustice which my parents instilled just came to the fore. And I just said what I needed to say, and it helped that I had my column, and I started speaking out. My board and my executive committee were very good. They gave me free rein. I basically wrote our press releases and I just put it out. And I turned MAC, Malaysian AIDS Council, into a very activist organization. Thanks also to Jonathan Mann, and that talk that I heard him give. And so I guess I just kind of grew from that. And in a way, I think I had it both ways. I did take, I guess, not deliberately, but I did take advantage of my position as a public figure, that I would get the attention. And why not? Attention for a good cause. Why not? It was a cause that had been hidden, that needed it, and therefore I would speak to it. And I just grew with that. And I got a lot of criticism because of my position as the daughter of. But I realized that they are not engaging with the issues. They were just attacking me because, well, I'm the PM's daughter. I don't wear hijab. I'm talking about all these funny things, but they're not really like, give me the solution. I'm trying to find a solution. You give me the solution. It cannot be put people away on an island. That's just not practical. So I guess, quite unconsciously, I just sort of grew along with it without really thinking that I got to be my own person or whatever. I just spoke my truth. I just spoke what I felt. And, that was all I was coming from. And coming back to that conference, I mean, that was a big moment for me too. You mentioned the way we conceptualized the whole conference. And I know some of the people involved in it are also listening in here. Rashida Shuib, for one thing. The theme of it was when theology meets reality. Because we realized at the time that all the ulama were talking among themselves about HIV/AIDS. And then all of us activists were talking among ourselves too. And we are talking also about religion, or at least the interpretation and all that, but we weren't talking to each other. So that was the whole point of it, to get people to see the reality. And that's why we put up, positive people on stage, transgender people on stage, everything. This is real. And they are Muslims. Of course, some people didn't like that. And yeah, that was the whole drama. But let me tell you that those 5 days I always think of as the worst days of my life. But those 5 days were also the days when I accelerated my growth. I realized that I had leadership skills I never knew I had. Because every day I was managing it, like do this way, this way, this way, you know, and it turned out well, actually, in the end. Some of the biggest rewards for me was that the conference didn't fail. It carried on. People went to their workshops or breakout sessions or whatever. It didn't stop. Secondly, that I had this very conservative Minister of Health from Balochistan in Pakistan come and thank me for organizing it. And I knew through friends in Pakistan that when he returned to Balochistan, he called up the HIV NGOs and said, I want you to educate all the ulama about HIV. So, you know, these are the rewards that you don't see it at the time. And at the time it was miserable and all that. But, you know, it does have an impact. It really does. And I remember very much that Mufti from Cote d'Ivoire or something hugging you in apology. And that was, I remember all the Malaysian reporters just staring open mouth at that because we're so unused to it. Mm-hmm. And then they were exposed suddenly in that one moment to the larger world of Islam. That it's not as, you know, dogmatic as what we have been brought up with. So to me, although I think of those days as awful, but they still came out, you know, quite well in the end. There are a lot of positive things that I could take from it. So yeah, you know, basically in that issue, although every night I was calling my mom saying, but I had to stand on my own. I had to find my own agency, you know.
I imagine it was way harder for you than even me, you know, like sort of literally being insulted like that, because you had the responsibility to maintain the ship. I mean, everything had to keep going. Exactly. And alhamdulillah, you know, as they say in Arabic, kulu khair fil akhir, you know, in the end, there were good things that came out of it. There were good things that came out of it even for me, because it really pushed me to stop being comfortable with the option to choose whether or not to engage sexuality with gender. But I wouldn't want to repeat it.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, one trial by fire is enough.
So we have like 20 minutes. No, actually it's down to 15. And that means it's not going to be room for more than 2 or 3 questions. So anyone wants to join. Otherwise, I will ask other questions myself. So if you have something you would like to comment at this time or question, please raise your virtual hand. I believe it's down there where you say participant or something. There's a reaction. There's a little thing. Okay, there we go. Layana, please unmute yourself if.
Yeah, hi. It's always wonderful to listen to both of you. Actually, sometimes it's like we feel like voyeurs. We just want you all to talk. But I guess my question is a bit, you know, like the current situation that we're in now. Most of your experiences were from actually being able to be with other people. So learning the empathy and actually, you know, meeting LGBTQ, etc. How do you foresee it going forward now in this very virtual world? You can't have large gatherings. Most of our conferences are all online. So how do you see, I guess, maybe the next generation learning the same empathy and having the same experiences that both of you have, really?
Well, that's a great question, actually. Yeah, and I think we have suffered a lot from not being able to interact, physically, and everyone's getting a bit tired of all this screen time. But I think there's been a greater need to connect during this time in our isolation. I mean, isolation is one of the worst things that can happen to human beings, I think, and we are seeing the effects of it. It's imposed on us quite harshly, and we've seen the effects of this lockdowns, and especially for women, the violence, the mental health issues, and all. But I think that there is a lot of awareness of that, and so people have tried their best to keep connecting, and in whatever way you can. If it's not this way, then the usual WhatsApp way. It's not enough, it's not good enough. But I think we realize that for the moment we just have to do this, and once it's okay, then we will try and meet again safely. I'm really impressed, actually, by young people who are very, very aware of the need to keep connecting, and they have devised all sorts of different ways of connection, because partly they're more savvy with social media and things. And I think this awareness that these connections must be maintained and even made better because of the fact that we are isolated from each other. I think the hard part actually is to maintain focus, because this whole pandemic just dominates everything. And we're worried about our livelihoods, we're worried about our families, we're worried about everything. And so it's hard to keep focus on very individual issues that people might be facing, not just from not having any more income or work, but also the mental health. There's been at least in Malaysia, there's been a huge uptick in awareness about mental health, and I've been trying to help where I can. But yeah, we're in a bind here right now.
I think there are lessons with this pandemic. I mean, I'm a theologian, so I see everything within a divine design. I think there are lessons for us globally as human beings. And I think the fact that every time we think we might slowly be coming up out of it, and then we end up, being pushed back, is because we're not learning the lessons. My daughter, who works on diversity and inclusion, anti-oppression, she says, I think the lesson is kindness, which is like, it's not so easy, Also, I want to do a shameless plug. I am at the moment investing in the construction of an online portal, which I will be calling TIST, which stands for Queer Islamic Studies and Theology. The purpose of which is to sort of simulate the experience that I mentioned with regard to the organization of that conference in 2003, and that is to bring the work done by activists and academics into a conversation that will hopefully also push back on the academic institutions to integrate the studies of sexualities and sexual diversity into their rubrics of Islamic studies. So keep me in your prayers. It's, as I said, we're building the building blocks now, but it will take advantage of being an online portal, and whatever virtual things may happen, I hope can be replicated in classrooms, in the future. Anything else from the gallery? Because as I said, I can go on myself. I guess I want to ask you about the years subsequently when you've been working with Sisters in Islam and with Musawah. I do my homework sometimes, and I went online and found a few events, like protest rallies and after the court case. against this. And I really do admire that when you come forward with what seems to me to be an independent location, that you determine for yourself where it is that you want to be on the issues. And nobody can, none of us can say anything about, the course of our birth. We're born where we're born, but that doesn't mean, I mean, that's the thing. I hope that's clear, that I admire so much of you, that you learn, you invest. I read your master's thesis recently on the trans communities in Malaysia. I learned a lot already. But how do you keep yourself motivated, irrespective of the fact that there's a pushback, and sometimes you might even get double pushback because you're the PM's daughter?
I don't know. I guess it goes back to that inherent feeling of what is right and what is wrong, and what is just and what is not just. And that's what keeps me going. Of course, it's tough. I mean, nobody likes the sort of pushback that you get for saying something. It's not fun. But I've taken some self-care methods. I don't read comments. I put things up on Facebook or Twitter, and then I leave it there. I don't read the what people say about it. The only time I have taken action, I have to say, is that I took a group to court for defamation, actually, for libel, because they were distributing leaflets saying that I was part of Comengo, which is the coalition of NGOs at the Human Rights Council. I think that's what it was. And that, a lot of distortion of what was said and everything. I was a member of the board of Sisters, and Sisters was part of Comengo, but I was not directly involved. But this group, which called itself an Islamic group, was distributing leaflets with my face and name, along with other people. I was the only Muslim, and distributing it in mosques and things. And when I first sent a lawyer's letter, they distributed more. So I had no choice. I had to sue them. It went to arbitration, I think, what do you call it? And eventually they had to give me a public apology, which, in the best traditions of, Islam, as they called it, they twisted around to make it sound as if they won. But I was tempted, but it would have led to a long court case, and I just didn't want to do it. So yeah, most times I just I guess ignore it. I think that's the best thing, that whole adage about not feeding the trolls is a good one to follow. And that's what I do. I only engage with people, even if they disagree with me, but if they're interested in actual engagement, then okay. But if you're just going to shout and scream at me about not wearing a hijab, first of all, that's usually the first thing, then sorry, I don't have time for you. So yeah, I think that's what keeps me going. And also, of course, I know that a lot of it is political, and I'm just a surrogate. And so I don't have to take this because.
So what's next for you? The memoirs are written, and now they need to be launched, and obviously you have to do a little bit of promo. And
I do. I'm a bit nervous.
Done.
I'm a little bit nervous because.
Can you talk to us a little bit about the memoirs, the name? And I love the name, so.
Yeah, I guess I can reveal the name. It's called The Apple and the Tree. And there's a reason for that. It's basically about my life as my dad's daughter, not just him as prime minister, but as the father he is. A memoir, of course, is meant to be non-fiction. It's true, but I do think that some people will consider it fiction, especially at the more recent events of how the country has gone, you know, after a wonderful election in 2018, where people power really, you know, got what they wanted, and how everything turned around in 2020 alongside the COVID pandemic. And that's the situation we're in now. Yes, I'm going to have to, well, the launch is end of November, and I'm going to have to do a lot of promos and everything, which will be interesting, given that I can't do any face-to-face. I can't do any real life promos, and we shall see. I'm hoping it'll be judged not just for content, but also for the writing, since I went to do a master's in creative writing.
Yes, you write very well.
Thank you.
It's good to have the journalism background, because then you're required to be productive. So the next thing will be, how do you fine tune the craft? So I love the
Yeah.
way that you wrote the dissertation that you shared with me. I mean, even the writing itself was very captivating, and then the stories themselves just, took me someplace else. As I said, I learned a lot. We are actually out of time.
Already.
And I told you it goes quickly. I just want to say, for the gallery, Marina and I did not confer on our color choice for today.
It's a Blue Monday.
It just sort of logged in and everywhere. But again, thank you so much for accepting the invitation. It really was my honor and my pleasure. I can't wait to get back. In fact, I'm having some dental work here, and I wish I could go to Malaysia and hang out and get my dental work done. But inshallah, may we all, make it safely through the pandemic for you and your families, and for your countries and the rest of the world. Inshallah. Thank you so, so much. There's a few thank yous coming out of the chat as well, Marina. I really
Thank you.
appreciate it. Thank you all for
Thank you.
showing up. Salam, salam.
I'm like.